The rod of Aaron was not an ordinary staff cut from a tree and then fashioned to suit the brother of Moses. The rod was more like the liahona, which was specially designed and crafted by the Lord for specific purposes. The rod or staff used to miraculous effect during the Exodus is normally called the rod of Aaron, or Aaron's rod. The Lord himself called it Aaron's rod when he commanded that it be placed in the Ark of the Covenant for sacred preservation. Throughout the biblical narrative, the rod belonged primarily to Aaron. Moses used the rod as well. At these times it became the rod of Moses. Yet it was not really the rod of Moses or the rod of Aaron. Neither of them fashioned it, nor did it really belong to either of them. Properly speaking, the rod belonged to God and was called the rod of God. The rod appears for the first time in the story of the Exodus, when the Lord is preparing Moses to confront Pharaoh. The Lord asks Moses to identify the object in his hand. Commentators widely believe that the rod refers to Moses' shepherd's staff. The Lord chooses to use what is at hand to effect his miraculous purpose. But this interpretation is based upon at least two assumptions. First, it assumes that Moses had the staff prior to his encounter with God. The account does not actually say where the rod came from, merely stating that the rod was in Moses' hand. There is nothing to preclude an interpretation that God provided the staff and then asked Moses about it. Second, because Moses was a shepherd at the time, the rod is assumed to be a shepherd's staff. This is possible, but other interpretations are also possible. The Hebrew mata, translated as rod, can mean staff, rod, scepter, or walking stick. Moses twice called the rod of God. This suggests that the rod was not his to begin with, and that it was more than a shepherd's staff or a walking stick. While the biblical account is silent on the origin and nature of the rod, other Jewish sources have much to say about the miraculous instrument. The book of Jasher relates that Moses first saw the rod planted in the garden of Ruel, otherwise called Jethro. The rod is not made of wood, but is a stick of sapphire. Moses miraculously removed the stick from the ground using the name of God. This stick, according to the account in Jasher, was the same stick which had been used earlier by God to perform miracles after the original creation. Jewish legend is more precise on the origin of the rod that became attributed to Aaron. The rod was a special creation, along with many others, made on the sixth day of creation. Of course, the creation of the rod is described in mythic language and in a mythic setting. The rod, like every other special creation listed in the legend, is based upon a heavenly and planetary archetype. But that does not make it any less real. The Liahona of the Book of Mormon was patterned after the same archetypes and was very real. The core idea is that the rod was created by God Himself and was done so before the dawn of man's dominion on earth. The sapphire stick, or Aaron's rod, was first given to Adam in the Garden of Eden. The first patriarch took it with him from Eden to till the ground. After Adam, the stick was passed down from patriarch to patriarch, finally reaching Joseph of Egypt. Clearly, the rod was more than a stick. It was deemed important enough to be passed to the male heirs, the patriarchs, and was even taken by force by Jacob as part of the birthright of the firstborn. At this point in the story, the stick curiously comes into the possession of Jethro, the priest of Midian. It is strange that an heirloom of such importance to the Hebrews would end up in the possession of an outsider. Moreover, if the rod was a sacred relic, as it was, why would the Lord allow it to leave the genealogical lines of inheritance? Who was Jethro anyway? The Bible is sparse on personal details about Jethro. When we first meet him in the narrative, he is called Reuel, a priest of Midian who has 7 daughters. Reuel, apparently in gratitude, offered refuge to Moses as well as his daughter Zipporah to wife. When we next meet Reuel, he is called Jethro, the name he is called by thereafter. When Moses returned from Egypt, he related to Jethro all the miracles the Lord had performed for Israel in its escape from bondage. Jethro rejoiced and offered sacrifice. Later, it was Jethro who advised Moses on the need to delegate authority. At this point, Jethro disappears from the narrative. None of this explains how the rod of God ended up in Jethro's hands. The Book of Jasher suggests that Jethro was an Egyptian noble. If this were the case, Jethro would have had access to the rod at the death of Joseph. Another tradition relates that Jethro was one of Egypt's magicians and the staff belonged to Pharaoh. Whatever the case, the rod became the possession of Jethro after the death of Joseph. Still, what is not explained in either the biblical account or in legend is why Jethro came to have the rod. The rod of God was a sacred token of the patriarchs, and God Himself attached great importance to the object. It was God that used the rod to assist Moses and Aaron in the miracles that brought about the Exodus. It seems unlikely that he would allow the rod to fall into the hands of an obscure priest in the land of Midian. Jethro was to be a temporary caretaker for the rod of God. Even so, he was not unqualified or unworthy to safeguard the staff until a rightful heir came to claim it. He was a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, as we learn in a revelation to Joseph Smith. Jethro received the Melchizedek priesthood from Caleb through a chain of authority extending back to the time of Abraham and the hand of God. Jethro's line of priesthood was apparently a branch of patriarchal authority. The Lord specified this separate line in his revelation to Joseph. The Lord was able to preserve the rod within patriarchal priesthood lines through Jethro. It was through Jethro that Moses received the ancestral rod. The rod of God was doubtless used during its long history from Adam to Jethro, but it was during the Exodus that it achieved its fame. It was in the hands of Moses and Aaron that the power of the rod was exhibited to the world. Though the rod did and will have other uses, it was intended by the Lord to be wielded by he who would liberate and redeem Israel from Egyptian bondage. Jewish legend explains this aspect of the story. When Moses saw the stick in Jethro's garden and took it, as the book of Jasher explains, many tried to take the stick, but only Moses was successful, since only he had the right to it. Another rabbinical source provides more detail to the story. The curious relationship of the hand of Zipporah in marriage and the possession of the stick can be explained by the fact that the stick was more than a patriarchal heirloom. It was a form of insignia of birthright and kingship, where royal marriage rights are attached. In the terminology of royalty, the rod was a scepter. As we will explain later, the rod of God became part of the regalia of the Davidic kings. It is not known for certain if Zipporah was the firstborn daughter of Jethro, though most historians believe she was. The fact that Moses was given her hand in marriage along with the possession of the rod of God makes it almost a certainty that Zipporah was the firstborn daughter of the high priest of Midian. In passing, we must note that certain elements of the story are mythic and not to be understood literally. For example, the rod was not made of sapphire, and it was not planted in the garden. This part of the story is a Hebrew variant of the Arthurian legend of the sword in the stone, where the hero alone can pull the scepter of royal authority from the ground. In spite of the mythic elements, the core idea of a rod made by the Lord, which he gave to Adam and then preserved to the time of Moses, we believe to be real. It is consistent with the verified history of the rod after the time of Moses. It is a well-attested fact that the rod and other important artifacts of the Exodus were preserved in the tabernacle, becoming sacred emblems of the nascent nation of Israel. After the rod had blossomed, the Lord commanded that it be placed before the ark containing the tablets. The stone tablets had been placed in the ark previously and were known as the testimony. Like the rod, a golden pot of manna was placed before the ark of the testimony. There is considerable debate concerning the placement of the rod and the pot before the testimony, meaning the stone tablets. While the biblical account is clear on the point that the tablets were to be housed inside the ark itself, it is less clear whether the rod and pot were likewise to be placed inside, or alternatively, outside but in front of the ark. The Apostle Paul was of the opinion that all three relics were stored inside the ark. A comment in 1 Kings states that at the time of Solomon, the only artifact in the ark were the 2 tables of stone. Some believe that the rod and pot were no longer to be found within the tabernacle and were likely taken by the Philistines when they captured it in battle. When they returned the ark, they did so without the pot of manna and Aaron's rod. Others believe that the statement in 1 Kings only states the obvious. The tables were in the ark itself, while the pot and the rod were outside of and in front of the ark, as was the norm. Jewish legend has it that the rod and pot, along with the ark and tables, were still extant at the time of King Josiah, who reigned over 300 years after Solomon. When the Babylonians conquered Israel, they destroyed both Jerusalem and its temple. It is at this point that the ark and its contents disappear from the historical record. The Old Testament does not record what happened to the ark. First Esdras relates that the Babylonians took the holy vessels from the ark, but the ark itself is not specifically mentioned. The fate and whereabouts of the ark, tablets, rod, and pot of manna remain unknown. Rabbinic opinion is divided, with some rabbis maintaining that the ark was taken to Babylon along with everything else in the temple, while others believe that the ark was hidden. It is our opinion that the ark, tablets, rod, and golden pot have been preserved and were hidden up unto the Lord, as were the important records and artifacts of the Nephites. The ark and its contents were simply too sacred to be captured and profaned by the Babylonians. Like the sacred treasures of the Nephites, the sacred treasures of the Jews were hidden up unto the Lord to be restored in the latter days. Despite being freed from the bondage of Egypt, the Israelites were not a particularly grateful or obedient people. There were constant murmurings in the camp and calls to return to Egypt. The Lord told Moses he wanted to kill the rebellious Israelites with a pestilence and disinherit them. At the importuning of Moses, the Lord relented and cursed all those who murmured from the age of 20 and above. They would die in the wilderness and never see the promised land. Things came to a head soon thereafter, when Korah, Dathan, and Abram, along with 250 princes of the assembly, openly revolted, seeking to replace Moses and Aaron as the priesthood leadership. This time around, the Lord was not as forgiving. He opened up the earth, which swallowed them all alive. Yet the Israelites were still intransigent. The very next day they complained about the killing of the rebels, whereupon the Lord sent a plague throughout the camp. In all, 14,700 were killed. At this point, the Lord took a course of action that ensured that there would be no more open rebellion among the camp of Israel. He directed that each tribe of Israel bring a rod with the tribe's name upon it and lay it before the tabernacle. These were, in effect, 12 caduceuses. Levi's rod was to have Aaron's name on it. The Lord promised that the rod that blossomed would indicate his choice to serve as high priest. Of course, it was Aaron's rod that blossomed, confirming his priesthood authority. This ritual enactment was designed to quell any further outbursts on the part of the members of the camp. Aaron's fruitful rod, as it is sometimes called, was placed before the testimony specifically to serve as a reminder and a warning against the rebellious. This raises an obvious question. How would a rod with almond blossoms and fruit impress or cower Israelites considering future rebellion? The response of the congregation to the placing of the rod before the testimony is quite instructive. With the rod having a prominent and permanent place in the tabernacle, the Israelites feared for their lives. They dared not even approach the tabernacle upon pain of death. What is curious about their reaction is the specificity of their fears. They feared imminent destruction only when the rod was placed in the tabernacle. They did not fear either the ark or the pot of manna or any other furnishing, all of which resided in the tabernacle previous to the rod. The fear of the rod of Aaron, the rod of God, was not unfounded. The Israelites had seen the rod in action and knew of its miraculous power and its ability to wreak death in large measure. After all, it was the rod that was used to bring down the 10 plagues upon the Egyptians, killing much of the nation in the process. They also saw Moses use the rod at the parting of the Red Sea and the subsequent closing up of the waters, killing Pharaoh's entire army in the process. Later, as the Israelites fought against the Amalekites, it was Moses holding up the rod that guaranteed military success. Though the rod is not mentioned in the slaughter of the rebellious Korah and his brethren, and the subsequent swallowing up of the 14,000 in the earth, the implied warning of the blossomed rod immediately after these events strongly suggests that Moses did raise the rod with lethal effect. It was the rod of Aaron which cowed the Israelites into submission and nothing else. The murmuring Israelites knew that if they dared even approach the tabernacle, let alone rebel like Korah, they would immediately be struck down by the power of Aaron's rod. In the popular imagination, the Ark of the Covenant represents unimaginable power, the power of God to level mountains and lay waste to opposing armies.
Good God.
Yes, that's just what the Hebrews thought.
Now what's that supposed to be coming out of there?
Lightning. Fire. Power of God or something.
Beginning to understand Hitler's interest in this thing.
Oh, yes. The Bible speaks of the Ark leveling mountains and laying waste to entire regions. An army which carries the Ark before it is invincible.
But the question now must be asked, was the Ark really the instrument by which God wielded power in behalf of Israel, or was it something else? When Joshua and the Israelites first entered the Promised Land, they were required to cross the Jordan River. It was at the Jordan River that the Lord made it a point to demonstrate to the Israelites that he would be with Joshua as he had been with Moses. The Lord would work his miraculous power through the new chosen leader. The object lesson was a repetition of a miracle performed by Moses early in the Exodus, the parting of a major body of water. Moses parted the Red Sea. Joshua, in turn, parted the Jordan River. Ostensibly, it was the Ark that parted the Jordan River. However, we must keep in mind two important facts. First, before the parting of the Jordan, the Ark had never been used to perform miracles. It was the rod that was the singular source of the power of God. As the Lord informed Joseph of Egypt, the power given to Moses was in the rod. Second, it was the rod, not the Ark, that parted the Red Sea. If this truly was a repetition of the first miracle, which the Lord indicated it was, then he would use the same modus operandi in both cases. He would use the rod to part the Jordan. It was not the Ark that parted the Jordan, but the rod inside the Ark which did so. The Lord was clear in his prophecy and promises to Joseph of Egypt that it was the rod in the hand of Moses that was the source of great power. It was the rod that aided Moses in gathering Israel and in parting the Red Sea. When the rod was later budded and placed within the tabernacle, or within the ark when transported, it retained its mighty power. The rod within the ark assisted in the Battle of Jericho. When the Philistines took the ark and profaned it in the temple of Dagon, the Lord smote them with a plague of tumors and boils. The Hebrew translated as tumor is ophel, and is the same word used to describe the boils that plagued Egypt. The rod which plagued Egypt later plagued the Philistines. According to the Hebrew Midrash, David used Aaron's rod, his staff, to slay the giant Goliath. David eschewed Saul's armor and instead chose to use his staff and sling. When he became king, David used the rod as a scepter. When he died, the rod was passed down to his successors.